Music is pretty underrated. I know, it's a bold claim for an industry that casually makes hundreds of millions every other week, but within the context of film, it seems that if you aren't explicitly keeping an ear out for it, this essential part of filmmaking can go underappreciated. I mean, be real for a second, how often have you had a review of a movie or a TV show and it included genuine opinions on the soundtrack? I know many find it hard considering that it's just one more thing to pay attention to in the complete sensory overload we call a motion picture, but those catchy tunes are sort of the backbone of the entire film industry, and in cases such as Guardians of the Galaxy, being the backbone of the entire franchise itself. Now look, I'm the furthest thing from a musician or a composer. Heck, I'm not really even qualified to talk about movies, honestly. But what I do know for certain is despite the seemingly inattentive reception a film's musical components can receive on the surface, everyone still ends up having their film experience dramatically shaped by it. Whether it be the eerie dissonance that keeps the viewer constantly uneasy during a horror flick, or maybe it's just a simple nice tune that gets stuck in your head and makes you think about a comedy weeks after you watched it. Music and film have just always had this weird but close relationship. Close in that these forms of expression can literally make or break the entire film experience depending on how well they mesh together. But weird in that the actual conditions of this partnership have changed quite drastically over time. Alright, stay with me for a second. You see, in the original dawn of film, sound recording technology had not been developed enough to be applicable to filmmaking cameras, leading to it being the age of silent films, a major leap in theatrical entertainment that included over-exaggerated movements to make up for the lack of dialogue. These films are revolutionary for an industry that would 100 years later be worth over $100 billion, but the thing about these silent films is that they were never really ever silent, because they always had one thing: music. Whether it be the live orchestra playing along to the movie sequences, or one playing pre-recorded pieces on a phonograph, which is basically just an early version of a record player. The actual practice of implementing music to set the tone for certain scenes was adopted from theater, and it continued to be such a vital part of the filmmaking process that even when proper recording technology did roll around in the late 1920s, pretty much ending the age of silent films, this really only opened up even more opportunities for music to be embraced. Composers were now being paid for original music and being known for their work in film, leading to actual legends being made in the game, including the likes of Max Steiner, Danny Elfman, Hans Zimmer, and the great John Williams. Their pieces would go on to become major reasons as to why certain pictures go from great to iconic. I mean, everyone knows the feeling of excitement that rushes when they hear a Star Wars main theme, or that feeling of wonder as you hear Hedwig's theme from Harry Potter. It seems that when these composed scores are done right, they can draw out such rich emotion that pushes the film's enjoyment into the stratosphere. Now, coming specifically into more modern times, the core principles have pretty much stayed the same, with this enhanced cinematic experience still stemming from musical involvement. However, it has strayed away from its origins in quite controversial ways, as we now have this system in which a film's attention can reach greater heights, but it can also lead to certain issues with the rising of abuse of said system. You see, orchestral sounds, while still being prevalent, just aren't the heavy go-tos for a lot of projects now, with many opting into more modern means for their main themes, such as implementing licensed or original music from artists themselves over an original film score from a composer. Franchises such as the Fast and Furious have pretty much always reflected the mainstream music interest of the time period with their movies. Just like at the soundtrack of the original 2001 Fast and Furious, with artists such as Ja Rule, Ashanti, and R. Kelly. Versus the 2021 release of Fast 9 with artists such as Inali Choppa, Polo G, and Jack Harlow. And then you have the Guardians of the Galaxy on the other side of that same exact spectrum, who have practically built their brands off the backs of licensed songs that are exclusively from the past, with music from the 70s, 80s, and early 2000s all being shown across the MCU trilogy. In fact, the original Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack mix peaked at #1 on the Billboard Top 200 album chart, when it was, funny enough, composed only of all previously charting music from the past, which is kind of a meta when you really think about it. Original orchestral scores are still widely used and are still fantastic, as they have this innate ability, when done right, to create such prominent emotional depth. But adding actual words behind a song from a recognizable voice has become an increasingly noticeable trend, because it does come with certain advantages, especially financially. Like, take these two all-time film classic tunes, In Binary Sunset from Star Wars and Concerning Hobbits from The Lord of the Rings. Almost everyone has heard of these songs, yet I would also guess over half of you guys either never knew these were the official names of those songs, or don't know what songs I'm talking about in the first place unless I were to outright play it for you. Which I would, but you know, I don't want my channel being taken down. Now compare these two revolutionary pieces of music to something like Happy from Despicable Me 2, which yeah, it is a well-made piece in its own right, but it's not nearly as iconic as the first two. Yet one translated into being a catchy song that gets stuck in people's heads occasionally, and the other translated to over billions in streams and going multiple times platinum. I know, it's a gross oversimplification, but the point I'm trying to make is that by tapping into the more mainstream music markets, you're building up this separate, powerful advertising entity that will help funnel attention back into your original film project later on, which is what some current filmmakers are willing to do rather than simply making hard-hitting composed music, as that will unfortunately hardly if ever reach out the confines of its own film. Happy wasn't just a good piece of music for a Despicable Me movie, but a trendy song that was likely to gain public traction in its own right regardless. It just so happened to be made for this particular Illumination project, and now any individual traction this movie has gained is then just going to be flooded back into the attention for the original movie. Compare this to something like anything off the Interstellar soundtrack, which was composed of nothing but profound masterpieces, yet it won't really build as much of an individual traction. It's not going to play on the radio, and it's not going to be in too many people's playlists. It will really only ever be fully appreciated within the context of the film, and that's why many people only identify these tracks as the Interstellar song instead of the piece's actual names. Like, you get what I'm saying here. Like, the most recent example I can think of is seen with the Super Mario Bros. Movie, a film that was filled to the brim with references, being a love letter to Nintendo fans of the past, present, and future, and the soundtrack was no exception to this type of care. And despite the committed work of composer Brian Tyler and his team to implement this iconic video game feel onto the big screen, the heavy amount of licensed music really detracted from most of the original score's appreciation. Now let's get one thing extremely clear: I am not subscribing to this elitist notion that original scores are simply and always better than licensed music. It's just the fact that with this heavy reliance on the mainstream, it's a bit more common for the synergy to be off between scene and song, and that was seemingly the case with the Super Mario Bros. Movie, in which the licensed music really appeared at the most inopportune times, leading to it being one of the weaker points of the movie. It's just easier to mess up when looking to spam licensed tunes instead of implementing custom-made pieces that are usually a bit more interpretive, especially if you are a greed-ridden production company that is extremely financially forward-first in their thinking. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to have a nice-fitting mainstream track in a film. Just recently, you've had Adonis interlude in Creed 3, which was a great montage music selection for a franchise literally known for their montage music selection. You also have Into the Spider-Verse, which was practically flawless on this end, especially with What's Up Danger and of course Sunflower. But the thing is that for every Sunflower you get a purple Lamborghini with the Suicide Squad 2016, a movie that was clearly made to try to capitalize off of having a hit mainstream track associated with the movie with the likes of big names such as Rick Ross and Skrillex. But when used in the actual movie, it was toned down completely to the point that if you weren't actively listening, you could have very well missed it. It was probably done on purpose though, considering that the original song itself didn't really fit tonally or thematically with the movie. I mean, yo, they even got the car wrong. The addition of music to the film sphere has done wonders to shape the perception of this illustrious form of entertainment, and this dynamic will continue to evolve as the ever-changing interest of the general public changes as well. Now, whether if the evolution of this partnership has shaped for the better or for the worse is another argument entirely, but what we know for certain is that these two aren't separating anytime soon.